General Motors downsized its full-size lineup for the 1985 model year and started with the luxury vehicles that were sold by Buick, Oldsmobile, and Cadillac. This included the 1985 Buick Electra, the 1985 Oldsmobile 98, and the 1985 Cadillac DeVille and Fleetwood. All were downsized for the 1985 model year. As opposed to the previous generation rear-wheel drive 1984 Electra that stood at 221 inches in overall length, the new 1985 Buick Electra would measure just 195 inches in overall length, a reduction of approximately 2 feet versus the previous year's version. It also would switch from being rear-wheel drive to transversely mounted front-wheel drive. And these were General Motors' first vehicles to be so-called full-size and front-wheel drive with that transversely mounted engine and transmission package. They certainly were not without their teething issues either. These 1985 designs had challenges with the power steering, in particular morning sickness issues where it was hard to turn the steering left to right, particularly on cold mornings. They had stalling issues, as this was the first application for GM of the use of a hot film mass airflow sensor that proved a bit troublesome, particularly in the 1985 and 1986 model years before it was redesigned for 1987. The turbohydromatic 440 T4 transmission would also have challenges with internal components, including the lockup and the torque converter, as well as various shift solenoids and other issues. In some cases, lines under hood were not routed correctly when production started, including power steering lines, and GM had to issue a technical service bulletin fix, and I believe even a recall for a power steering line that was routed very close to the exhaust manifold on initial vehicles. And in some cases, the hot exhaust would burn through the power steering line, which would then rupture and spray all over the hot engine. When it came to interior componentry, perhaps the most challenging issue with these C-bodies were the window regulators that were tape drive and would tend to break and then fail, and the door glass would fall into the door. And the window switches themselves would fail in short order as well. You'd have to replace those with a newly designed unit. Under hood, I mentioned the stalling issues associated with the 3.8-liter fuel-injected engine, but 1985 was the only year that you could get a carbureted 3-liter V6 under hood in these vehicles. That was standard, and that 3-liter V6 also had its issues. It had relatively weak bottom ends, and they were good for lasting maybe 80 to 90,000 miles at best if the engines weren't pushed. There were just overall lubrication challenges with the bottom end, and they weren't strongly designed, despite the fact that that 3-liter was a derivative of what would soon become one of GM's legendary engines, the 3800 V6. Also for 1985, there was another issue under hood. Who could forget that 85 was the only year that you could get a diesel in your C-body? That was the 4.3-liter V6 diesel that was based on an Oldsmobile 350 V8 design with 2 cylinders lopped off. While the Olds 350 V8 diesel was introduced in 1978 and was really a dieselized version of a gasoline engine with many modifications, definitely, to it, the engine experienced so many issues in the marketplace that it soured Americans on diesels for years to come, and in some cases even still to this day. By contrast, the 4.3-liter V6 diesel was not based on any gasoline engine because Oldsmobile never made a V6 based on its V8s. This was a diesel from the ground up, and it was indeed a much better design than the Oldsmobile V8 diesels, but it still had its challenges, particularly with intake gasket leaks and in some cases injector pump issues. But overall, it was a better diesel than, as I mentioned, the Oldsmobile V8 diesels, which, by the way, there were 2 sizes. In any event, one of the issues that was unique to the Electra that wouldn't be found on the Oldsmobile 98 or the Cadillac DeVille or Fleetwood was that Buick decided to employ a clamshell hood on these, kind of similar to what Saab was doing at the time. And the hood and the mechanism itself proved to be one of the biggest challenges for Buick engineering in the early days of this 1985 C-body. It appears that the designers who penned the 1985 Electra wanted the vehicle to have a, different hood, shall we say. where the top of the hood would actually form what was typically the shape associated with the top of the fender. The hood draped over the side of the vehicle, as you can see in this picture, and so when you open the hood, you were effectively taking the fender tops with it. This was a design that was also supposed to carry on into the rear and have a uniquely opening trunk, if you will. But for cost reasons, the rear portion of the design was canned in favor of a more typical trunk lid that opened just like any other trunk. But the hood design that opened in this strange fashion was kept as part of the 1985 Electra's introduction, and it would prove particularly problematic in early model years. So what was the challenge associated with this? Well, in order to activate or open the hood, you'd pull the hood release from inside the vehicle. Then you'd have to walk out of the car and pull the hood forward about 6 or 7 inches toward you. Then once you had pulled the hood towards you, you could rotate the hood upward and expose the engine underneath. That wasn't really the challenge associated with this hood design. The challenge was more associated with closing it. And the principal issue was that you had to obviously execute the steps in reverse with one special caveat. And that was that you first rotated the hood back onto these rollers that were on the cowl. And then once the hood was rotated to be in place, you would push it back toward the windshield of the vehicle and enable it to close. The problem with the early designs on these 1985 Electras was that the hood spring that popped the hood up when you first released the hood was too stiff. And so what would happen is many people, as they tried to close the hood, would not keep their hand on the hood as they closed it. Instead, they would kind of give it a shove like you would any other hood and just release it and hope that it closed on its own. Because that hood return spring was so stiff, it actually prevented the hood in many cases from closing if you elected to close it in that manner. And as a result, what would happen is the hood would not fully latch. In fact, it would nearly latch closed and then spring back and then hit the stop associated with the secondary hood latch. And when it did that, the hood would kink, and it would be damaged pretty much irreparably by doing that. You can imagine that people who saw this happen live as they were just trying to close the hood on their car must have thought, what in the world just happened, as they put a tremendous sized kink in their hood that, as I mentioned, would really necessitate putting a new hood on the vehicle. In subsequent years, that hood spring would be revised so that it was less stiff, and it helped mitigate the issue that I'm talking about. But it still did exist. If you didn't give that hood a strong enough push or keep your hand on the hood as you closed it all the way until it was latched, there was a tendency for the hood to kink. So bear in mind, if you do buy one of these Buicks, and whether it's an 85 Electra or all the way up through the final model years before the Electra was redesigned in the 90s, keep your hand on the hood all the way as you latch it. Do not take your hand off. Push it down with force and push it down with your hand on it, and that will mitigate this issue from happening. Unfortunately, such guidance was often not provided to the early adopters on these 85 Electras, and they suffered this hood kinking issue along with a host of other teething issues that I previously mentioned. Thanks for watching this video on the 1985 Electra hood. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and check out the video thumbnails at bottom left and right for some suggestions for you.